Under the hard white light of a congressional hearing, every detail feels sharpened, papers rustle like whispers, microphones hiss with anticipation, and the gallery holds its breath. Representative Matt Gaetz sits poised, shoulders squared, voice calibrated to command. His confidence radiates through the chamber. Every phrase lands like a practiced strike, meant to shape the record and the room. Across the table, Representative Jasmine Crockett remains motionless, eyes steady, her composure almost unnerving. The contrast is magnetic, assertion meeting restraint, volume facing stillness. What begins as procedural questioning quickly thickens into something else, an invisible contest between dominance and discipline. Each interruption chips at civility's edge, until the tension hums so loud it almost drowns the microphones. Viewers lean forward, sensing the tilt about to come. Then, the inevitable break, Gaetz cuts in, intent on control. For half a breath, the air itself seems to hesitate. Crockett exhales once, the calm before ignition. And in the seconds that follow, clarity, precise, reasoned, undeniable, slices through the noise. Because what she says next doesn't just reclaim her time, it reclaims the whole conversation. If moments like this remind you why truth, grace, and composure still matter, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and reflect. Because every exchange like this proves that courage doesn't shout, it steadies. When integrity holds its ground against noise, democracy doesn't just survive, it strengthens. The hearing that day was not extraordinary on paper. It was one of dozens scheduled across the year. Routine exercises in oversight meant to preserve accountability within government operations. But beneath the formality of procedure, the atmosphere was charged with a familiar, combustible energy. The room was filled with lawmakers, aides, and reporters who had seen this dynamic unfold before. Moments when oversight became theater, and theater became headline. Every exchange, every interruption, every flash of temper could live on forever in a 30-second clip online. At the center of it all sat Representative Matt Gaetz, a Republican figure both seasoned and polarizing. Over his years in Congress, Gaetz had built a reputation for being articulate, sharp, and unflinchingly bold. His supporters saw a master of rhetoric, someone unafraid to challenge the establishment with precision and flair. His critics, however, viewed the same qualities through a different lens: performance over principle, provocation over substance. In many ways, Gaetz embodied a new kind of political communication, one that valued dominance of the moment as much as the depth of the argument. Across the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat whose demeanor seemed to exist in deliberate contrast. Before her election to Congress, she was a civil rights attorney in Texas, known for taking on cases others avoided, cases where dignity and law met at the breaking point. Her voice carried both courtroom precision and moral conviction, shaped by years of defending those who felt unseen. Crockett's rise in public life had been defined not by sound bites, but by steadiness. She spoke with the kind of control that forced listeners to slow down, to actually hear. That day, their paths intersected over a procedural dispute, an inquiry about accountability in administrative decision-making. It wasn't the kind of issue that would normally ignite emotion, but hearings rarely unfold in clean lines. Each side arrived with its own rhythm, its own intent. Gaetz moved swiftly, his words designed to establish authority, to dominate the narrative before others could intervene. Crockett waited, listening closely, her silence neither submission nor hesitation but calculation. This was the moral contrast the American public has come to recognize: performance politics versus principled governance. One seeks victory in the moment, the other in the message that endures. The tension between them mirrors a deeper struggle within American democracy, between the impulse to win arguments and the responsibility to elevate them. For Gaetz, the hearing was an arena, a place to showcase command of language and leverage. For Crockett, it was a record, a space where words become part of history, where tone carries as much weight as text. Each understood their role, each believed in their own control of the room. Yet neither anticipated how quickly tone could eclipse title, or how power, when tested, often reveals itself through restraint. The cameras caught every micro-expression, Gaetz's sharp glances toward the chair, Crockett's measured pauses before answering. Around them, the hearing's rhythm began to shift, no longer about the topic alone, but about the way democracy itself is performed. And within that shift, an unspoken question surfaced. Who truly commands the room when confidence meets composure? But what no one expected was how quickly that composure would turn silence into strength. The hearing moved in steady, predictable rhythms at first, a choreography of procedure. Pages flipped, microphones clicked on and off, and the chair recognized one speaker after another with the practiced cadence of bureaucracy. But beneath that order, the room was alive with subtext. Every question carried an edge. Every pause concealed calculation. The reporters along the back wall sensed it before anyone else, that slow tightening of tone that turns a hearing into a moment of confrontation. Matt Gaetz leaned forward with the confidence of someone who had studied both the rules and the optics. His words were clipped, deliberate, designed to cut through the clutter and land in the headlines. Would the gentlewoman yield for a point of clarification? The phrasing was courteous. The inflection wasn't. He didn't wait for a full response before continuing, threading another question into his own, a practiced maneuver that blurred interruption into inquiry. The rhythm of his voice quickened, sentences stacked like dominoes, each one falling into the next before anyone could stand one upright. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless. Her pen hovered over a notepad, tracing the outline of a phrase she hadn't spoken yet. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the committee chair, then back to Gaetz. She knew this tempo, the rising speed, the subtle escalation masked as professionalism. It was familiar from the courtroom, from cross-examinations where dominance came disguised as dialogue. She set the pen down. The click echoed faintly like punctuation breaking a paragraph. The air thickened. Small murmurs fluttered through the gallery as Gaetz's tone sharpened. He referenced precedent, quoted procedure, gestured lightly with his hand as if conducting the room itself. Each movement reinforced authority, an image crafted for the cameras, for the clip that would circulate within minutes of adjournment. And yet, there was something uneasy beneath the precision, a sense that control built too tightly can't hold forever. Crockett inhaled slowly, a breath so subtle it was almost invisible. Her stillness drew attention in ways noise couldn't. She wasn't silent out of defeat. She was choosing the exact moment when silence would speak louder. Those who've been underestimated learn that power often lies in patience. From the witness table, a staffer shuffled papers nervously. A few rows back, an observer whispered, "Here it comes!" But it hadn't yet. Not quite. This was still the rising action, the delicate climb before gravity takes over. Gaetz continued, his questions overlapping the answers he demanded. The tone wasn't angry, but there was insistence in it, a need to frame the exchange as his narrative. He cited rule numbers, procedural timelines, oversight obligations, until the words themselves began to sound less like inquiry and more like incantation. The more he spoke, the more his voice filled the air, leaving little room for anything else. The camera panned to Crockett again. She leaned slightly forward, elbows on the desk, hands clasped, the posture of someone assessing, not reacting. Her eyes didn't narrow or roll, they simply observed. It wasn't a glare, it was study. The longer she waited, the more palpable the imbalance became. The audience felt it too. The tension of a string pulled taut, waiting for a single note to release it. Meanwhile, the chair's gavel hovered inches above the block, a silent warning. Parliamentary decorum was the last thread holding the moment together. Everyone in the room could feel that thread stretching thinner. The narrator's voice, calm and detached, could have said it aloud. It wasn't about party lines. It was about whether composure can still stand taller than provocation, whether the virtue of listening could still disarm the art of interruption. Crockett adjusted her microphone slightly, a gesture so deliberate it seemed almost cinematic. The faint scrape of metal against wood quieted the whispers. She smiled once, faintly, not out of amusement but recognition. She had seen this strategy before. The rapid-fire questioning meant to control time itself. And she knew that timing, once turned, could undo even the most calculated performance. Gaetz finished another pointed inquiry, leaning back as if expecting immediate defense. The pause that followed was longer than he anticipated. In that small delay, something invisible shifted. It wasn't defiance, not yet, just the subtle reversal of energy when the pursuer begins to feel watched. For those watching live, the change was almost imperceptible. But to anyone attuned to the rhythm of power, it was the turning of a tide. The cameras caught it. Crockett's calm expression, her steady inhale, her fingertips resting lightly on the desk. The room waited for her to speak, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she looked down at her notes one last time, drew a single underline beneath a word no one could see, and closed the notebook. The gesture signaled readiness. Not aggression, not resistance. Readiness. The gallery stilled. The gavel remained suspended. The air seemed to contract, holding its breath with her. Every person in that room, lawmaker, aide, journalist, felt the shift without fully understanding it. What had started as an ordinary hearing was now something else entirely. A study in restraint, a demonstration of how control can move from the loudest voice to the quietest moment. And in that pause, less than a heartbeat, something shifted. The breaking point came quietly, not with a shout, but with a breath. The camera cut between their faces, Gaetz leaning forward, Crockett holding still. He had interrupted mid-sentence again, a seamless maneuver wrapped in parliamentary phrasing. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, that's not responsive to the question," he said, his voice clipped, the cadence designed to reclaim the narrative. The words hung in the air like a gavel's echo, but Crockett didn't look rattled. She lifted her gaze, deliberate and unhurried, her tone steady as she replied, "Reclaiming my time, sir." The syllables were clean, restrained, but their gravity pulled the entire room into focus. It wasn't a shout. It was a rebalancing. For a half-second, Gaetz blinked, unsure whether to proceed or pause. Around them, the hearing room seemed to narrow. The murmurs in the gallery died out. Pens stopped moving. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence where words usually lived. Crockett adjusted her microphone slightly, her hand steady. "With all due respect," she continued, her voice even, "you've spoken long enough to define me without once choosing to hear me. So let me clarify, not for you, but for the record." The words landed like slow percussion, deliberate beats, building a rhythm of control. Each sentence began softer than the one before, but ended sharper. "This hearing is not theater. It's oversight. It's where we decide whether accountability means performance or principle. And while you may prefer the soundbite, I prefer the truth on the record." Her phrasing was unhurried, surgical. It didn't accuse, it revealed. Gaetz leaned back slightly, his posture still assertive, but his expression flickering between engagement and calculation. He opened his mouth, but Crockett didn't yield. "Sir, you've had your turn," she said, calm as glass, "and I've listened. Every word. Because democracy demands that we listen, even when it's uncomfortable. But what democracy does not demand is submission to disrespect disguised as decorum." The statement struck the air like a clean bell tone. The journalist rose, rippled. Someone mouthed, "Wow." A staffer blinked rapidly, caught between admiration and alarm. The chair glanced between them, unsure whether to intervene. Crockett's composure didn't waver. She glanced at her notes once, then lifted her head again, eyes clear, expression neutral but alive with purpose. "I came here to do the people's work," she said. "Not to out-talk anyone, but to outlast the noise." A single tap of her pen punctuated the words. Across the table, Gaetz's usual rhythm faltered. His hands, previously animated, settled flat on the desk. The control he had maintained through tempo and tone began to erode. Not because he had lost the argument, but because he had lost the timing. Crockett had slowed the pace of the room until it matched her heartbeat. She leaned slightly forward, lowering her tone. Every time a woman is interrupted while trying to speak truth, it's not just her moment being taken. It's the record being rewritten, and I won't let that happen here. There was no tremor in her voice, only resolve, the kind that years in law had refined into calm precision. She didn't raise her volume, she didn't need to. The room leaned in to hear her. That, she knew, was the quietest form of authority. Gaetz tried to interject, but even his breath seemed mistimed. "Congresswoman, if I may." Crockett didn't look away. "You may not," she said, still evenly, "because my time is not yours to cut short." A few people in the audience exchanged glances, not in amusement, but recognition. It wasn't defiance. It was discipline. Her 30 seconds unfolded with an almost musical symmetry, a crescendo built on balance. "The record will reflect," she said, "that I have not raised my voice. I have not broken decorum. But I will not be minimized while fulfilling my duty. Accountability requires precision. Respect requires restraint. And both," she paused, "require that we listen as much as we speak." Each phrase seemed to carry more weight than the one before it, like the tightening coils of a melody reaching its final note. The narrator, if there were one, might have said it aloud. She didn't humiliate him. She reminded everyone why composure isn't weakness, it's control earned. For a moment, no one moved. The cameras caught Gaetz's small adjustment in posture, leaning back, one hand brushing his tie. The energy in his delivery had dulled, replaced by the awareness that something irreversible had occurred. Crockett had turned the entire tempo of the exchange from acceleration to stillness. And in that stillness, the moral authority shifted. She closed her notebook and folded her hands, signaling her conclusion. "Mr. Chairman," she said evenly, "I yield back." The chair nodded, momentarily at a loss for words, and murmured, "The gentlewoman's time has expired." But the phrase rang hollow. Everyone in the room understood that time, for once, had belonged entirely to her. Then came the silence. It wasn't awkward, it was reverent, the kind of silence that follows truth spoken too plainly to refute. The air itself felt rearranged. A journalist in the back row finally whispered, "That's going viral." Another leaned toward her recorder, whispering, "That's not about politics, that's about power." Crockett didn't look around. She sat back, shoulders relaxed, her expression softening. There was no triumph, no smirk, just composure settling back into its seat. Gaetz cleared his throat quietly. "Well," he began, forcing a smile, "I appreciate the Congresswoman's passion." The words, though polite, landed weakly, a rhetorical retreat, masked as acknowledgement. She nodded once, courteous but unmoved. "Passion is easy," she said softly. "Discipline takes work." That was her last line, and the last anyone would clearly remember. For several seconds afterward, no one spoke. The gavel didn't strike. The audience didn't breathe. The cameras captured her stillness framed by light, the image of composure reclaiming space where noise had filled it. And when she finally looked down, pen tapping once more against the desk, the room exhaled as if released from a spell. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete. The silence stretched. Not the awkward kind, but the rare kind that follows truth delivered so cleanly it leaves no air for argument. The hearing room seemed suspended in time. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the collective inhale. That subtle, nearly synchronized sound from the audience, staffers, and even a few lawmakers who had just realized they'd witnessed something shift. The cameras zoomed in on Gaetz. His eyes flicked down toward his notes, then back up, searching for the next move. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words stalled. For once, the congressman known for rapid-fire retorts found himself in the strange terrain of silence. Not the tactical kind, but the genuine kind born of recognition. He had pushed, prodded, and interrupted, only to find the entire balance of control slipping away. Not through confrontation, but composure. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers, methodically, with a quiet rhythm that became its own punctuation mark. Each fold, each adjustment of the microphone seemed to reinforce what everyone now understood. The real authority in the room was no longer procedural. It was moral. The chair cleared his throat softly, perhaps to reclaim the structure of the hearing, but the sound came out thin, almost apologetic. It didn't matter. The dynamic had already rewritten itself. Crockett leaned back slightly, her expression neutral, her posture unwavering. She didn't need the audience to applaud, though, internally, Many of them already were. The power wasn't in the reaction, it was in the restraint. She had taken an exchange built for television drama and turned it into a masterclass on balance under fire. The camera caught Gaetz again. He adjusted his tie, straightened his notes, and forced a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was no clear defeat to mark, no outburst, no gavel strike, no overt declaration of loss. And yet the audience could feel it. The tone had inverted. The noise had ceded to nuance. Somewhere in the back, a journalist whispered to another, "That's the clip." The other nodded without looking up from her recorder. "That's not about politics. That's about presence." What had just happened wasn't the usual congressional spectacle of voices clashing over sound bites. It was something rarer, a public reckoning with composure itself. Crockett had demonstrated that control wasn't a posture. It was a strategy, one that could dismantle aggression without mirroring it. From a psychological lens, it was a perfect inversion of dominance. Gaetz's approach, rapid, declarative, performative, relied on volume and rhythm to command attention. But Crockett's tempo, deliberate and still, disrupted that circuit entirely. She didn't resist his energy. She redirected it, forcing the audience to tune into her silence rather than his speech. It's a form of moral aikido, turning the force of one's opponent inward until it exhausts itself. Viewers watching the replay would later describe it as grace under fire. But in that moment it was something deeper, the visible triumph of control over chaos. Her restraint had a weight to it, not passive but intentional. She had given no rise to emotion, no opportunity for distraction. Instead, she let the silence do the speaking. And in doing so, she reminded the room that power isn't proven by who talks the loudest, but by who can stay calm when challenged. A staffer nearby, eyes wide, whispered, "Did that just happen?" Another nodded slowly, still staring ahead. "She didn't just answer him," he said. "She changed the temperature of the whole room." The narrator, if present, would frame it this way. What the cameras captured wasn't humiliation or triumph. It was a recalibration, a reminder that clarity outlasts spectacle, and grace under pressure is still the most disarming weapon in public life. As the session resumed, Gaetz spoke again, briefly, cautiously, his tone measured in a way it hadn't been before. The shift was unmistakable. The rhythm of the hearing had changed, the authority redefined not by force, but by finesse. Crockett didn't react. She listened, nodded once, and jotted a note. That was her punctuation. Understated. Complete. And just as the gavel tapped to move to the next item, the moment sealed itself into collective memory. One woman's restraint dismantling an entire performance of power. And just when it seemed over, the internet turned her restraint into a rallying cry. The hearing ended the way most do, with shuffled papers, muted chatter, and the metallic ring of microphones being switched off. But outside that chamber, something was already in motion. Within minutes, staffers texted the timestamp to colleagues, journalists clipped the feed, and producers began slicing the footage into the segment that would soon loop across every political channel and social media timeline. The moment wasn't built for virality, yet it became viral anyway. Not for outrage, not for insult, but for precision. Viewers replayed those 30 seconds not to see conflict, but to witness its quiet unraveling. On one screen, a political commentator leaned forward, slowing the clip down frame by frame. "Watch here," he said. "The pause before she speaks. That's rhetorical discipline." On another, a news host smiled faintly. She didn't raise her voice, he noted, but she shifted the power dynamic entirely. Across social media, reactions cascaded in real time. One headline read, "Calm over chaos, Crockett's 30 seconds that silenced the room." Another countered, "Gaetz meets his match in a masterclass of composure." The thumbnails varied. Some chose Crockett's poised gaze, others froze on Gaetz mid-interruption, but the subtext was universal. People were starved for moments like this. The montage unfolds, a scrolling feed of reactions, voices from every corner of the spectrum. A law student tweets, "That's how you reclaim your time and your authority." A civics teacher posts a short clip captioned, Tomorrow's lesson: the art of composure in democratic discourse. A retired journalist writes simply, "She didn't argue. She realigned the conversation." Even those who disagreed politically with her couldn't deny the technical brilliance. One conservative commentator admitted on a panel, "You don't have to like her politics to recognize that's how discipline looks under fire." Another replied, "It's the kind of moment Congress used to produce," before every question became a soundbite. In the digital echo chamber, this subtlety stood out precisely because it wasn't loud. Amid a culture that rewards outrage, Crockett's restraint became its own kind of rebellion. The clip didn't trend as a gotcha moment, it trended as a sigh of relief. The collective reaction wasn't, "She won." It was, "Finally, someone didn't take the bait." Cable news followed suit. Split screens flashed, Gaetz on one side, Crockett on the other. Analysts dissected tone, phrasing, timing. "Look at the control in her cadence," one linguistics expert noted. "Each sentence lands like a verdict. Not shouted, but stated." Another added, "That's the difference between emotional reaction and moral response." By evening, late-night hosts had picked up the exchange, some turning it into commentary, others into reflection. But even in humor, the takeaway was consistent. She had modeled something audiences rarely see anymore: strength without spectacle. The next morning, classrooms, podcasts, and civic study groups began discussing it. A public speaking coach broke down the sequence in a workshop, calling it a masterclass in rhetorical balance. Law students analyzed it for its precision under procedural pressure. Educators used it to illustrate how listening can be as powerful as speaking. The camera of the collective consciousness replayed that moment again and again. Crockett's measured tone, Gaetz's brief silence, the faint rustle of papers marking the shift in control. It became a mirror of a larger question. In an era of constant noise, what does real authority sound like? Comment sections filled with thoughtful takes, rare, reflective, almost reverent. One viewer wrote, "I didn't realize how exhausting political yelling had become until I watched someone simply stay calm." Another added, "This wasn't about left or right. It was about right versus reckless." For a brief window, the conversation rose above partisanship. It became a study in human behavior, not ideology. Crockett's performance wasn't celebrated for its defiance. It was studied for its discipline. She had shown, in under half a minute, that conviction and composure could still coexist. By the second day, the clip had crossed platforms, from political Twitter to Instagram Reels, from Reddit discussions to LinkedIn think pieces. The phrase 30 seconds of fire became shorthand not for confrontation, but for control under pressure. And somewhere in that digital swirl, as headlines scrolled and reactions poured in, a quieter current took hold. Admiration not for her politics, but for her poise. In an age when so many mistake volume for vision, one exchange reminded millions that the truest form of strength doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand. And through every replay, every headline, every classroom rewatch, one truth lingered. Composure, once again, had cut through the noise. The clip's immediate surge across timelines wasn't just another entry in the daily churn of political media. It exposed something deeper, a quiet hunger in the public consciousness. After years of noise, confrontation, and performative outrage, people didn't share this exchange because it was fiery. They shared it because it was measured. Crockett's 30 seconds were less about the verbal exchange and more about what it represented: the possibility that integrity could still stand its ground, unarmed, unshaken, and unamplified. In the modern American political landscape, hearings like this often become arenas of posturing rather than platforms for accountability. They unfold as spectacles built for viral recirculation, moments engineered to go big, not to go deep. Yet, every once in a while, something punctures that rhythm. A pause, a silence, a person who doesn't take the bait. That's what this moment became. Not a battle for dominance, but a redefinition of strength. Political scholars noted the response with fascination. It wasn't the substance of disagreement that captured the audience. One analyst wrote, It was the style of restraint. In an environment trained to reward immediacy, Crockett's deliberate pacing felt almost radical. She didn't fight for the floor. She simply occupied it, calmly, fully, without apology. The phenomenon wasn't unprecedented. History has shown that moral authority often announces itself not through loud declarations, but through quiet conviction. Viewers were reminded of other pivotal congressional hearings, moments when civility outlasted spectacle. In the 1950s, during the Army McCarthy hearings, a single question, "Have you no sense of decency?" had deflated a political juggernaut built on intimidation. In the 1970s, during Watergate, the soft-spoken precision of questioning dismantled walls of power more effectively than any grandstanding could. The pattern was clear. Every generation rediscovers that self-control, when exercised in the public square, holds more transformative power than outrage ever can. The Crockett-Gaetz exchange became a contemporary echo of that principle. It wasn't about who won. It was about who held the line on dignity. The message traveled far beyond Washington. Classrooms used it to discuss civic ethics. Leadership seminars cited it as an example of composure under provocation. Communication experts analyzed its cadence and posture. Even in polarized forums, the tone of discussion shifted slightly, however briefly, toward reflection. People weren't arguing about what was said. They were wondering why it resonated. Psychologists of political communication observed that audiences, consciously or not, yearn for what they rarely see: emotional intelligence in real time. In a divided era, strength has too often been conflated with dominance, the ability to out-talk, outlast, or outshout. But Crockett's moment illuminated another definition. Strength, she demonstrated, can also mean refusing to descend, holding your ground with discipline instead of disdain. That's why, for many viewers, watching her composure felt like watching civility defend itself. The power shift was emotional, not ideological. It reminded people that democracy, at its healthiest, depends not on who wins an argument, but on how the argument is conducted. Each hearing, each debate, each exchange in public office is more than a contest of ideas. It's a test of character. The consequences extended subtly yet significantly. News outlets began revisiting how political behavior is framed, not merely as clashes, but as conversations with moral dimensions. Teachers and parents, weary of seeing aggression rewarded, shared the clip with younger audiences as an example of grace under scrutiny. The moment fed into a national reflection. Maybe the true victory in discourse isn't silencing the opponent, but elevating the conversation itself. And beyond the noise of social media, it stirred a quiet recalibration among viewers. Many wrote about feeling oddly hopeful, not because they agreed with every policy or position, but because they witnessed, perhaps for the first time in a while, that decency still held persuasive power. It wasn't nostalgia, it was relief. When civility trends, it reveals something profound about the culture watching. It signals fatigue with performative aggression and a desire for authenticity that restores rather than divides. The viral reach of that hearing wasn't the triumph of one voice over another. It was a collective recognition that how we speak to each other still matters. As analysts later summarized, the moment distilled the enduring paradox of democratic discourse, that the loudest microphone may echo furthest, but it's the steady voice that resonates longest. Crockett's calm didn't erase confrontation. It transformed it. And in doing so, she reminded millions that emotional composure isn't weakness. It's the quiet architecture of authority. Maybe what we witnessed wasn't a clash of politicians, but a rehearsal for the kind of dialogue democracy still needs. When the trending clip finally slips beneath the tide of the next headline, what remains is not the argument, but the atmosphere it created. The echo that lingers is quieter. The reminder that democracy breathes not through dominance, but through dialogue. In an age addicted to instant reaction, those 30 seconds felt like an exhale, a pause long enough to remember what respect sounds like. Jasmine Crockett's composure became more than a political moment. It became a moral archetype. Her calm didn't humiliate or conquer. It educated. She modeled something far more enduring than verbal sparring, the discipline to let truth speak at its own pace. There was no need for dramatics, no appetite for spectacle. In the stillness between her words, the hearing room rediscovered what authority sounds like when it's rooted in integrity rather than impulse. The narrator's voice softens. In 30 seconds, she showed that facts don't need volume, only conviction. That single truth resonated beyond the chamber. It entered classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms as a quiet invitation to reconsider how we define power. Because real strength in public life and private life is not measured by how loud we speak, but by how carefully we listen before responding. What Crockett demonstrated was emotional literacy in motion, the ability to hold her ground without losing her grace. It's a skill that transcends ideology and time, a civic art as essential as voting, empathy, or debate itself. In a culture that often confuses confidence with aggression, her restraint reminded millions that self-control is not silence, it's strategy. Her exchange with Matt Gaetz will fade from the headlines, as all political moments do. But its echo, the posture, the patience, the precision, endures as a small but significant lesson in civic maturity. It shows that democracy's pulse quickens not in the noise of confrontation, but in the rhythm of understanding. That listening, too, is an act of leadership. For viewers, the takeaway wasn't about sides. It was about standards, about how truth-telling can still coexist with respect. Crockett's poise became a case study in modern rhetoric, a reminder that every citizen, whether in Congress or in conversation, holds the power to elevate discourse rather than erode it. And so long after the hashtags fade and the soundbites lose their novelty, the moment remains, distilled into something elemental. A lawyer turned lawmaker, a pause turned principle, a conversation turned classroom. Because when courage comes dressed in calm, it doesn't just win an argument. It restores faith that democracy, at its best, is still a conversation worth having. The lights fade, and the echoes of the hearing dissolve into memory. What endures isn't applause, it's example. In that brief exchange, we witnessed not spectacle but substance, not a contest of volume, but a quiet victory of discipline over disruption. Moments like this remind us that the real power in politics isn't control, it's composure. It's the courage to hold the floor without losing your voice, to speak truth without sacrificing grace. That's the kind of strength that sustains democracy, the kind that teaches rather than taunts. If you value truth spoken with calm conviction, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and reflect, because every measured word, every thoughtful exchange, every moment of grace under pressure keeps democracy breathing. And in times like these, even one steady voice can remind us what leadership truly sounds like.